Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation, Pablo. I'm really happy to assist, and thank you to the people in the room for joining this session, because I've looked at the other two sessions, they look extremely interesting, so I hope I won't disappoint you. I'm also very pleased to speak at this event, which has, I must say, one of the most fascinating titles I've ever seen for a conference. And I particularly like, of course, the from the ground up part. And I'm also very much interested in the multi-scapes, and particularly so in the thoughtscapes. It's very comfortable to speak just after the talk of Chris, which was fantastic as well. So he opened up already a lot of avenues for further discussion that I can refer to. So I'll be talking about how people think about animal source foods, how they look at livestock, and how it has evolved over the time and where it may be going in the future. And I'll talk also, of course, about food systems. And looking at food systems over the last couple of years, I came to the conclusion that there are three major issues with the conversations around food systems that are really causing concern. And the first one is the insistence on very top-down approaches to what is basically a very complex system, I should say a complex adaptive system. And they call it a great food transformation or a great reset, and what else you have. So the problem here is that it narrows down a potential wide set of solutions to a very monolithic view on the food system. And the danger, of course, is that if you start messing with a complex system, the danger is that the system will kick back, and the kicking back will be in very unpredictable manners. So you may have plenty of black swans that are very hard to anticipate. So that's a rather dangerous approach. And the more sound approach would be to tinker with the system, mostly from the ground up, indeed, and see where that ends up. My second concern is the corporate takeover that we're seeing of the dialogue, and that's particularly valid for the United Nations Food Systems Summit. There have been severe complaints and severe critique coming from the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, from grassroots organizations such as La Via Campesina, and even also from some academics. So there's a clear attempt of big corporations to steer the conversation, and especially situated at the World Economic Forum and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and so forth. And then the third point is that a lot of the conversation is built on unstable foundations. And that's because they're intrinsically or inherently in that conversation, you have those binary divides. So you have a binary divide that, and there are a couple, we could talk about a couple, but the one I'm going to focus on is the animal-plant divide. So what is going on is that we're trying to trace an artificial line throughout our historical diets. This is a schematic overview of the historical human diet, very schematically, of course, where you see the Paleolithic diet and the Neolithic diet, and then you have the Western diet. And we're trying to trace a line that divides plant and animal foods, whereby plants are presented as mostly beneficial, and the animal foods mostly as almost intrinsically harmful. And that's particularly the case for red meat, of course, but it starts to spread to the whole category. Whereas the obvious line that we should draw is the one on the Western diets, which are characterized by hyper-extractive production methods and an abundance of ultra-processed foods. So this basis is not a sound one to have a conversation, because there are clearly harmful and beneficial practices from both sides of that binary divide. This is nonetheless what ends up very often in policy documents, and it's also what is being spread by mass media. And we studied that in a discourse analysis, where we looked at how meat and health were portrayed in the Daily Mail over 15 years, the first 15 years of the century. And in short, the basic conclusion is that messaging is very confusing, and also that it's very conflicting, because on the one hand, animal foods are presented as, particularly meat specifically, sorry, meat is presented as something that is good for you, and the other half of the conversation was representing meat as something that is harmful. And so within the same newspaper, you get these very conflicting messages. This is an example of some headlines where you see that on the one hand, it's claimed that if you eat lots of meat, it will destroy your fertility. And on the other hand, you have some articles that say that meat is actually good for fertility. And at the same time, what we also see is that there is an increasing trend in sensationalism. So the way we talk about meat and animal source foods is one that becomes increasingly sensationalist. And you can see this here measured by the length of the title. So the length of the titles and characters increases spectacularly after, with the years, basically. Whereas in the beginning of the century, the messaging was rather neutral and equilibrated, even in the Daily Mail. What is going on? I think an interesting approach here is to look at this binary problem, and to approach that in a more so with a certain conceptual framework. And because I'll be talking about pyramids quite a bit, let's have a small detour to ancient Egypt, because in ancient Egypt you'll find the Sphinx, and the Sphinx is a source of wisdom. And he talks in riddles. Wisdom often comes in riddles, and this is a riddle presented by Jacques Derrida. What is a cure and a poison? So what can be both a cure and a poison? Well, actually many things, or most things, are actually both cure and poison at the same time. And he has, well, it goes back to ancient Greece, but Derrida speaks of the pharmakon, and the pharmakon is something that you also find in the concept of medicine. If you talk about pharmacy, a pharmacy is where you buy your medicine, but the medicine is also a bit of a poison. So there's this whole ambiguity that is valid for most of the concepts that we're using on a daily basis. But interestingly, within the pharmakon concept, you also have the idea of pharmakos, and that means scapegoat. So there's something about scapegoating that is within that binary tension that you have between two extremes. And an example still from ancient Egypt is Hathor. Hathor is a fertility goddess, and she is represented by a dairy cow. So she brings nutrition to Egypt. And at the same time, she's also goddess of destruction and a goddess of vengeance. And interestingly, she's unleashed by Ra to punish humanity for its sins. So you have the scapegoating bit a bit coming through, and she destroys the agricultural fields. So she brings nutrition and she destroys the food supply system at the same time. So that's a very familiar image that we can also basically see reflected in the way we talk about cows today. So if you look at animal agriculture, and if you look at ruminant agriculture in particular, of course, there are many ways that are destructive. There are many ways that you could farm your animals and be destructive. So you have the concepts of deforestation and monocultures and fossil fuels, and you could have effects of overgrazing and soil erosion and water pollution, you name it. But on the other hand, you also have the extremely elegant conversion of natural resources. You start from rain and sun and grass, and you can mobilize your livestock to create topsoil, to sequester carbon, to generate biodiversity, or to maintain biodiversity. So you have equally very harmful practices and very beneficial ones. So if you want to look at this and you want to quantify, you want to steer, you want to intervene, you will need metrics. And those metrics allow you to compare different systems. Now, the problem with metrics is that they're often taken out of context, or that the interpretations are often reduced to a handful of metrics that are trying to summarize what's going on. And a typical example is the CO2 equivalents per kilogram metric. So that overlooks a lot of complexity, not only with respect to the atmospheric gases, but also with respect to the foods we're looking at. And usually you will find these kinds of graphics, for instance, this one from the World Resources Institute, where you have a comparison of different foods. And then at the bottom of such graphs here, you will find beef and lamb and foods that are punished for their methane emissions. And at the top of those graphs, you will find other ones that are scoring, they have very low scores on an emission basis. Now, the problem here is that this is expressed as tons of CO2 equivalents per million of calories consumed. So this reduces the whole concept of food and diets to a metric that expresses the effect on a calorie basis, which is not representative of a food system, because food is about much more than calories. Calories are by far not the most important thing to talk about. It's much more interesting to talk about essential nutrition, for instance, because we know that the great challenges for mid-century are not on the level of calories. They are related to micronutrients and to protein quality, and many of those are best obtained through animal source food. So if you take them out of this food supply system, or you restrict them to very low amounts, you may run into trouble. And nonetheless, in many high-profile articles and policy documents, you will bump into this kind of comparisons where, once again, you have this binary divide between, on the top here, foods that are considered to be environmentally destructive and bad for your health, and you always find red meat as the worst example, or unprocessed red meats. And at the bottom half here, you will find the ones that are to be stimulated. Now, if you look at the system like this, and it's also valid for the one on the left, you will find that such products as sugar-sweetened beverages are doing quite well. On the left, you see that sugar and palm oil and soybean oil are the ones with the lowest environmental impacts. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. And still, these are the kinds of graphs that you will find in the policy documents. I would like to zoom into the health discourse for a moment. And this is a typical example of nutritional advice. This is the Flemish food pyramid as we use it in Flanders, so the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. And what you see here is the typical division on the top of the model. It's an inverted pyramid. On the top of the model, you'll see plant foods. And at the bottom, you find the animal source foods. And the more you go down here, the more you have to restrict it. And red meat is placed all the way under butter even. So it's really down in the model, and it's supposed to be restricted to substantially. Now, all processed meats, and that includes also the traditional processed meats such as salamis or cooked hams or cured hams, are expelled from the model, and they are situated in this red circle that contains alcohol and junk food. And you have a gradient. You have a gradient from plants to animals. Now, if you look at so if you come up with this kind of advice, we should at least have good scientific evidence. And now, recently there has been a series of articles in the Annals of Internal Medicine looking at the evidence that states that we should restrict red and processed meats. And when they evaluated the quality of the evidence, then their conclusion was that that the evidence is only weak to very weak. So they actually recommend not to change consumption. Now, that's only about health. We're not talking about environmental issues, but the health debate is built on weak evidence. And that's because the absolute risk reduction is trivial. And more importantly, we're not even sure that those risks are real in the first place, because there's only very low certainty of evidence if the associations that you find are very small. Now, why I'm mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because we know that people that want to live healthy lives generally eat less red meat. So what these associations are capturing is not so much a nutritional or physiological relationship, but something that is situated in the thoughtscape, because it captures how people think about meat. It captures how the upper middle classes basically eat less meat because they think it's less healthy. That's what nutritional lipidology is very often in numbers. And I'm also showing this because there's a third point that the authors are making that I would like to continue with. And they're stating that except for the more conventional scientific approach here, they're stating also that, well, if the evidence is so weak, and we also know that people's attachments to meat-based diets is so pronounced, well, we don't see any reason why they should eat less of it. So that's an interesting part, because it puts the finger on something crucial here. How do people look at these foods? What is the support within communities for meat? And that's, of course, a historical process. And to understand if people really are indeed having a kind of craving or a need for meat, well, we better look at the overview of human needs and try to situate it within this. Now, a model to use here is the one of Abraham Maslow, which is the pyramid of human needs, or the theory of human motivation. and that model is a hierarchical one, and the model puts emphasis at the bottom of the pyramid. So we have another pyramid here. At the bottom of the pyramid, you find nutrition and physiology. These are the basic needs. Then you have the security need, you will have the community need, you continue with status, and then you have self-actualization at the top. So there's a gradient from the biological to the social, to the individual, basically passing through the social. Now, his theory is based on empirical data that he obtained from his patients, and that's an individual model, basically. But what I would like to do is to use it or to apply it to communities. I know it's not very conventional to do so, but I think the same ideas are valid at the community level. If you look at animal source foods and the way we have been thinking about animal source foods, I think it's absolutely essential that we also try to understand how ancestral models looked at it. And in ancestral models, mostly the ones of hunter-gatherers, animal source foods, and then we're talking about meat and fat and all the other foods that were obtained in the hunting process, they were essential for food security, but they were also essential for our nutritional needs. We basically introduced them in our evolutionary diets, and they became essential to us. And because they became essential, the next need you see here is to try to secure the supply of those foods. And that's how we organize ourselves as hunter-gatherers. And by doing so, we needed also to construct communities or specific hunter-gatherer clans that are functional, because otherwise there's no way that you can guarantee this. Now, the creation of communities is not it's not a trivial thing. It's difficult because if you put people together and you want them to be coordinated and function well, then you need to balance that community. It's clear that animal source foods and hunting have been absolutely fundamental for the balancing of communities, for the structuring of communities. And also the act of animal killing is a very interesting point here. The act of animal killing was very much ritualized. It's a very ritual act. And it functioned as a focal point around which the clan structured itself. And by doing so, it creates a kind of nucleus, it creates a kind of crystallizing of worldviews, and it maintains the community. And it also flattens out intraspecific aggressions through a process that René Girard has described as mimetic desire. So within communities, what happens is that mimetic desire builds up. If I have something precious and I show it to my neighbor will want to have it, but I will not want to give it to him because I like the fact that he likes it, but he cannot have it. And that creates frustration and eventually aggression. The mechanism that communities have to deal with this is the mechanism of scapegoating, and that releases the tensions. And animals have always functioned as scapegoats. So that's where you have those scapegoating mechanisms coming in, being part of ancient human behavior. Now, that's mostly a Paleolithic model or a hunter-gatherer model. If you move into the Neolithic transition, what happens is that communities will settle down, and that you will have the emergence of a new layer in the pyramid. Well, it's basically also there with hunter-gatherers, but hunter-gatherers do their utter best to suppress it. And that's the one of status. So while settling down, resources accumulate, the first elites are created, and the food supply system changes. And we see now that the whole food supply system is built around grain and taxes, and animal source foods are mostly reserved for the elites. Well, they're shared among the community, to be fair, and that happens during ritual sacrifices, once more, where the animals are sacrificed to the gods, and the meat is distributed, but the best meat goes, and most of it goes to the elites, goes to the priests, and goes to the aristocrats. And the lower cuts are spread among the rest of the population. So here you see that meat starts to be not only creating a horizontal connection, but also a vertical one. It is used to create a gradient of power, where meat starts to express very heavily power connotations. After that, you have the transition to the industrial period. And and that happens because of technological progress for a large part, because you have railroad systems developing, you have refrigeration systems that develop, and a couple of other things, and that allows for the large-scale production of meat. And because of the parallel with urban development and purchase power that rises, there is a demand for meat within the developing cities. Now, this creates at the same time also a value shift. What you see at the top is a comic from Belgium, Tintin, and Tintin goes to Americas and he goes to Chicago and he sees how a cow is entering a factory and comes out as corned beef and sausages. And that's the industrialization, the commodification of animals. So what happens here is that you have a value shift from humans being zoophages, eaters of animals, and they become sarcophages, or eaters of flesh, of meat. So meat is becoming a product, is becoming something that is absolutely commodified. But at current times, we are entering a new stage, and that's probably the one of the necrophage, where certain parts of the population start seeing the eating of meat as the eating of death. So it's not about eating the animals anymore in respectful manners, it's about taking their lives and seeing meat as murder. And that creates a lot of moral crisis within the whole paradigm. So also with the post-industrial developments, what seems to happen is that the entire worldview, the entire construction of the Maslow pyramid is starting to be upside down, whereby the layers at the bottom are taken for granted and the ones on the top are becoming extremely magnified. So there's an extreme focus on status, there's an extreme focus on self-actualization, and we tend to forget about all the rest because we go to the supermarket and we find the food that we need rather easily. And at the same time, we have this transvaluation of values where everything that was supposed to be good for us becomes bad. And whereas meat was seen as something that was normal and necessary and natural and nice, the famous 4 Ns, now meat is seen as something that is abnormal, that is unnecessary, that is unnatural, and that is disgusting. And that is also very indicating a strong focus on purity, on self-restraint, and on societal anxieties. And it's interesting to see that the first vegetarian societies are coming from a spiritual background. Now we've seen that throughout history. There are many anecdotal stories about vegetarianism, which was connected to spiritual approaches, and it has been entering the mainstream discourse during the 19th century with the Bible Christian Church, coming from the Swedenborgian Church, and ending up with the Grahamites and with the Seventh-day Adventists, and whereby meat was presented as something that we should not eat because it was exciting us, it was creating lust, and we should go back to the Garden of Eden diet. And so this is toying with the idea of meat being a source of nutrition and strength, and trying to invert it. And this message was then connected by the likes of John Kellogg, which was also a Seventh-day Adventist, to the health reform movement, and the first fake meat industries and the first processed food industries that tried to imitate meat. Now, one of the proteges of Kellogg, Glenda Cooper, was one of the co-founders of the American Dietetic Association. And so the whole discourse entered the medical discourse through household economics and through other channels. This was then connected also to Ansel Keys' saturated fat story and these anxieties about ecological anxieties and the ideological problems that we have with the eating of meat and the vegan movements. And that creates a cocktail that is the one that we're dealing with today. So the situation isn't all that balanced at the moment. So it seems like we have somehow got off track and we have to face this pyramid that is somehow upside down. Of course, this pyramid is reductionist. It's one model that tries to describe the situation. So I don't want to overstate it, but it's a helpful model because it shows that we are kind of ignoring the basics here and that we're too much focused on things that maybe don't matter all that much. And it becomes interesting when we see that there's a crisis coming in. You could look at it through the lens of the COVID crisis, or you could look at it through the lens of the climate change crisis, and you will find the same ideas coming up. So if you have an upside down pyramid, of course, it's a wobbly thing, and you can look at all the levels, and you will identify the problems. For instance, if we have with the striking of the COVID-19 crisis, what people typically did was to go to supermarkets and rush on the shelves and try to get all the valuable foods, the ones that have the reputation of being nutritious foods. And certainly meat became something that was important, and dairy as well. People started to Google for things like vitamin D and zinc. So it illustrates that we're finding ourselves in a situation of metabolic health that is disastrous. Now we're talking about 90% of the American population that is currently not in a status of optimal health. So clearly it puts the finger on the underlying problems. We've seen the food security issues as well at many occasions when a crisis comes in. And then we start to think also about the community problems, because we are isolated at home, we have the lockdowns, loneliness is really emphasized, and people start to understand that communities are starting to erode. And you have left what's at the top here, the focus on self-actualization and the development of the self and the likes on Facebook, and the problem with status, together with the increasing inequalities and all the class anxieties that go with it. So together with all this, you have this situation where that is ideal for the creation of scapegoating mechanisms and also authoritarian reflexes. So how do we go on from here? Well, it seems that part of the strategy seems to be to double down on what we're already doing. And one of the ideas is to take out livestock, to imitate animal source foods, using those metrics and spreadsheets that are based on the spreadsheets that are based on the use of those metrics, such as CO2 equivalents per kilogram, for instance. And the result of it is that on the nutritional level, we probably will end up with more ultra-processed foods and nutrient-poor foods, that we will increasingly see corporate control taking over. We'll increasingly see that the food security system is becoming fragile, that nutrient security is becoming fragile. We see a further erosion of food cultures. We have increased moral eating going on, increasing polarization between the way people look at food and what you're supposed to eat and what you're not supposed to eat. So this is going nowhere, or if it's going anywhere, it's going for worse scenarios. So the message I would like to connect here to the livestock systems is that animal agriculture, despite everything being said, still has its role to play, and importantly also its stories to tell. And that's again valid for the different levels of this pyramid system. So it's about providing essential nutrition, it's about providing livelihoods and the creation of resilient production systems. It's about bringing people back again around the table. It's about commensality. It's about traditions and the place that animal source foods have in those traditions. And it's about changing the resentment feelings and all the anxieties and giving them a positive twist and developing, finally, once again, a sense of pride. And it's also, actually, for the self-actualization level, it's also about creating a learning path. And the agroecological systems and Regen Ag and the way that we start to look at soil again is clearly a learning path for many. And that is probably what we will have to do if we want to improve the system for planetary health. It will be to indeed acknowledge the pharmacon, acknowledge that livestock has both negative and positive effects. It will always have positive and negative effects, but acknowledging it and trying to emphasize what's positive and trying to minimize what is harmful. And there are many ways forward. And probably you will have talked about this during this conference in the past, and you will talk about it in the coming sessions. But there are many ways forward that could be explored. Fame for Health clearly animal source foods can damage health, but in many ways it can also be very beneficial for your health. Now, if you process your meat in harmful ways, well, it will be indeed something that will be undermine public health. Now, but if you include it in wholesome diets, it can only improve it. So the focus is on the wrong place. It should basically be on the ultra-processed foods and the insulin resistance and the chronic inflammations that go together with this, and understand that and bring it back to adequate essential nutrition. So let me end with this slide. This is the article that we have been writing, which goes in much more detail than what I've been saying here. I'm just scratching the surface and trying to convey the most important ideas. So this is the article where you'll find more information. And let me just finish this with a quote of George Orwell, which I think is an important one because it's absolutely true. It could be plausibly argued that changes of diet are more important than changes of dynasty or even of religion. Now, it is really within the thoughtscapes that the next steps are to be expected, because it's we can try to optimize practices, but it will not make a difference as long as there is no shift in the thoughtscape, which is the basis for everything. And with this, I would like to finish my presentation and thank you for being attentive.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. That was a fantastic talk. Not only because I'm a co-author of the paper, but it was fantastic, just really enjoyable. That's what we were expecting. That was very provocative as well as it was Chris. So open the floor for questions, discussions, and challenges.
Great talk, thanks a lot. Very thought-provoking and a lot of interesting issues, and I like inverse of Maslow's pyramid. I like the idea that it's wobbly, one inverted. You may not have heard my talk, but I was talking about livestock within rewilding systems. So livestock play a role which is now taken up by a lot of the species of large herbivore that are now extinct across many of the continents, North America, South America, Europe, obviously, not so much in Africa and in Australia. One of the things, therefore, is the fact that livestock provide a range of ecosystem services other than just food. And so I think that it would be interesting for your thoughts on adding that aspect, not just the sociological aspect, but actually the services that livestock provide, which are beyond the consumption part, and how that will change our relationship with livestock and what that relationship is likely to look like in 50 years from now.
Yes, I fully agree, and we address it slightly in the paper. Now, of course, in a presentation like this, you have to select your emphasis, but I absolutely agree. Of course, it's the thing with Maslow is that it's a very humanistic approach. So it puts the humans in front. But if you use it properly, it will automatically couple it to the landscapes and to the animals as well. Because to generate your basis of this pyramid, you will have to do that anyhow. But if you get it up front, you get the feeling maybe that it's a very humanistic and very human-centered approach, which is true because it's coming from human psychology. But it nonetheless doesn't block us from seeing it more broadly and understanding the more holistic interconnections with all the other scapes. And certainly ecosystem services are absolutely important. And it's one of the things that are very difficult to capture also in the metrics. And so if you design those transitions and you use those metrics, those ideas are almost never there. You'll find them maybe in the more qualitative assessments, such as the FAO documents where they will talk about it, but they will never really include them as a value or as something that should be included in the assessment. It's always qualitative, it's on the sides, and we overemphasize the quantitative part. So that probably is one of the reasons why it's not included, because we have this techno focus on numbers.
Yeah, so but I think that if you look in 20 to 30 years from now, livestock will be seen as beyond just consumption, so that the angel will be more at the fore than the devil, right? Because of the nature of the range of services that they provide.
Yes, yes,
that's
well.
Just me being optimistic.
Yes, and I hope it's indeed the case, because I think it's probably one of the biggest chances we have to reevaluate livestock is the fact that we will that it will be shown that because it's very dangerous that if you confront somebody from Impossible Foods, where they say that livestock has to be taken out of the equation completely, so within a decade. so if this starts to, because there are already some trends going in that direction where we start to take them out of agricultural landscapes and we start pushing even more to other systems, I think we will have to face that ecosystems are falling apart. At least the grasslands and understanding that the grasslands are essential. So I think understanding that will come. It's unavoidable. People will start to realize that, and it can be a catalyst. So I hope it will be a catalyst.
And that's this. There any question? I was looking at you, Chris, and you were noting the thing. So, any comment?
Got a couple people.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, I have I think that whole point about well, the first of all, the point about quantitative versus qualitative, the idea that knowledge is only knowledge if it's quanta is something that actually stops us learning and stops us looking out beyond the spotlight. That's the first thing that I really agree with. It's also that thing about moving from including the yin within the yang, and it's going into post-normal science, etc. But the other comment I think is really useful is about the role of animals, because it's quite frustrating to me when you think about I don't like services, ecosystem services. I like gifts. So these things it's not a transaction. It's in terms of it's more of a relationship than a transaction. So the animals are so integral to the health of soils and landscapes and themselves, and yet they've been narrowed. Someone's put a spotlight on one thing within what an animal is, which is frustrating. So it's a comment, not a question.
And if I may, I think the transactional part is also absolutely important, and that's not only valid for the ecosystem services that that are indeed transactional activity. It is valid for everything. It's valid for the eating itself, and that's what we lost. The transactional, I put it down very briefly in 2-3 slides, but the transactional part was always heavily present within human-animal interactions. It has been abstracted. And that's the commodification at play here. So the killing of animals, the way we think about the killing of animals is something that is absolutely fundamental here. And as long as we don't try to make this more transactional or more based on reciprocity, or at least that's a more horizontal approach, then we're going to run into trouble, because I don't think the evolving thoughtscape is able to continue the way it's going now. Something needs to be done also in the way we think about the killing of animals today.
Is there Lynn, you were starting to make a comment and I interrupt you.
Oh, also on the killing, I thought the talk was really fascinating, and I really liked the stuff about metrics, where depending on the metric you use, you could arrive at the conclusion that you needed to eat lots and lots of palm oil and sugar to save the planet and your health, which is pretty ridiculous. But also killing, I've been thinking about it, and it's part, I think, of a whole denial of death, period. That we just try to deny that it exists. But then the thing that I really wanted to say is that ecosystem services, the whole diet thing and all these ridiculous conclusions about diet, and I personally have friends who have harmed themselves permanently trying to eat healthy, the whole thing only in the United States, where food is coming out of our ears, right? Can we somehow, for some reason, which has to be psychologically, want to restrict what we eat so much? It's crazy. But then about the ecosystem services thing, in California, livestock are hugely valuable for fire hazard reduction and for just plain biodiversity. I mean, they're really important. And the food stuff, that whole food machine, if you want to, I'd hate to say machine, Chris, but that whole machine thing of food, you know, you've got to avoid meat, blah, 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 makes the ecosystem services thing harder, because then you've got parks that want to graze for biodiversity and to reduce fire hazard. It's the best fire hazard reduction we have in the state. They get criticized because they're releasing methane into the air, or they're, you know, raising this horrible substance. So the things that it feeds into this cycle, it just feeds into, we're just having a hard time right now coping with not being able to provide all these ecosystem services because there's something evil about a cow. So I thought your talk was very thought-provoking. I'm going to read all those papers. So thank you.
Thank you. Lynn, John, you were commenting as well.
Sure, I'll throw in a comment. I guess, you know, I've made the statement. I'm not trying to ruffle feathers, but knowing that I will, that livestock are going to have to be shown to be more than just food. I mean, the ecosystem services that they provide are going to be what keeps livestock in the equation, from my perspective. You know, I have a friend, Forrester. He says, if you want to save a tree, use a tree. You know, we have to use those products. And part of our challenge right now is that we, as a species, are becoming more divorced from our ecosystem. As you see rural, you know, areas depopulating, more people moving to urban spaces, and they have less connection to where their food comes from. They don't really have a sense of what livestock do and what it means. Another conversation today, a guy was trying to create wetland habitat that would have trails and that sort of thing, and people would engage with it. And the regulators were saying, no, we can't do that. We got to leave these wetlands alone. But it's only through the use and the engagement that we're going to save that. And so we have to have some way to also bring people from urban scapes into rural scapes to understand what's going on and how all these processes work and their benefit. Otherwise, I don't see a way forward for livestock, and, you know, at a global scale.
No, I think this is one of the key issues here, because you see it also in the way they're trying to market imitation products. They're trying to reduce the whole conversation on purpose to a couple of specific elements, so that their whole strategy is based on making people believe that livestock products are completely equivalent to the imitations, plus that the imitations have this ecological benefit. So they're trying to present them as similar. So it's very bizarre that the whole anti-meat movement tried to provide imitation meat rather than providing wholesome vegetarian solutions, right? But that's because they want to replace it, and they're doing so by making it bleed, and by, you know, these imitation burgers, they bleed, and the marketing slogans are they taste and they cook and they do exactly the same thing as the original. And you see it in the nutritional discourse, where they try to summarize the whole nutritional complexity to protein. It's all about animal protein. It's never about all the other components that you'll find in the foods. It's always about the protein transition, and the animal source foods are summarized as animal protein. So you can, again, quantify it. You put a number on it, you know, there's so much protein, and then you just substitute it for so much protein from the other side. And as long as people don't understand that this is not true, that is not holding true, because there's so many other dimensions that are just being swept away, then it's going to be very hard. So this is the part that society needs to understand, that the debate cannot be reduced to a protein transition or to a replacement of a burger by another burger. It's about the whole package that comes with it, and that of course includes the ecosystem services, very much so.
Thank you very much, Frédéric, for the very interesting talk, especially with this historical perspective. I agree with that totally very interesting. But I absolutely do not agree what you analyze for the time being and what you give for the future. I do have the feeling, maybe also, Lynn, to be a little bit provocating, we are all here somehow in a romantic screen. Sorry, we do have to feed 10 billion people. And if you look to the figures from the FAO, the problem is not anymore hunger, the problem is obesity. And if you look to the figures regarding the nitrogen cycle and the nitrogen surplus worldwide, the problems are coming from animal husbandry. And it is not the husbandry land somewhere in the steppe and prairie ecosystems. This is industrial animal husbandry without animal welfare, which is not in line with human beings from my perspective. And this is a problem. That's what you are mentioning. I don't agree with that. And if you come then with the argument, okay, it's more, we do have to discuss more on a qualitative way, not on a quantitative way, because metrics are not easy to interpret or to discuss. We do have all the metrics, and you can bring them all together. If you don't want to have calories, you can rely on the functional unit protein, you can micronutrients, whatever you take. So, and you totally neglect all the problems worldwide, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, which are coming from overgrazing. I have been worldwide around in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, looked at the regions. We have desertification in Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, and Pablo is with us, Paulo Carvalho from Brazil and the Cerrado. So we do not have these benefits, what you're mentioning. I agree with you in a situation maybe of 1950, where we did have 1/3 of our current population. But your perspective is not convincing to me to a future feeding the world in an appropriate way. I think our message has to be much less, but better. That's okay. But we should be very, very carefully to, bring food from animal origin, and especially from beef, on a specific physiological, moralistic way, which is fine with human beings for the future. I think then we totally neglect the challenges we do have. Nobody does really stress to eat once a week a steak or something like that. That's not the problem. But you are addressing not solution for the future. I don't see that. Sorry.
Well, it's not really what I was saying. I think it's my issue is that that indeed most of the approaches that I'm seeing coming out, and most of the modeling approaches I'm seeing are based on those reductionist metrics approaches. I'm not seeing a lot of more sophisticated approaches where you would indeed combine all the things you need. I still see the ones that are using, even if you talk about CO2 equivalents per unit of protein, there's a lot of complexity behind that, because we clearly underestimate protein needs in society, and that also connects to the obesity problem and the cardiometabolic diseases. So there's a problem with the way we estimate how much protein people need. There's a problem with all the other factors that you have in those foods that you will have to replace if you take it out. So probably we'll have to eat less meat, but I don't think it's a good way to calculate it and impose it top down by saying we have to halve it, or like the Eat Lancet Commission is saying we have to reduce it 90%. Those numbers are based on very debatable calculations. I don't think you can just do that. What you do is you fix your bottom-up approaches. You make sure you have no deforestation. You make sure that you cut down, that you stop the water pollution. You try to do things. You try to do something about the overgrazing, and then you see up with how much meat you end up. And that's how you approach it, not by coming up with a number that has to be imposed on the planet and implies a certain reduction. Because whatever is being said about the complexity of the models that are being used, I think there's still serious problems. We could talk about the details and we could discuss about each individual metric and how it's being applied. But in most of those metrics, we either completely disqualify all the nutritional complexity and we summarize it in a couple of ideas about, because you're not going to measure hunger just by looking at calories or grams of protein. And obesity is not the only problem. It's the underlying condition of hyperinsulinemia, it's the underlying condition of metaflammation, and those are connected to poor quality foods. That's what we need to do something. That's what we need to tackle in the first place. Well,
there are some
it's a matter of vision on a matter of vision of solutions, and we're not supposed to agree on everything. But I think it's dangerous to follow a lot of the modeling tracks that are being outlined for us at this very moment.
Well, I'm just saying that there's no doubt that meat production can be harmful and needs to be fixed. Same with agriculture. I mean, you're talking about destroying whole ecosystems, draining aquifers, plowing lands that are highly erodible. There's all kinds of problems with crop production too. I mean, there's just no doubt about that, and it's going to keep us all busy for a long time. In places where I've seen, I've traveled around the world myself, and in a lot of places, overgrazing, I think it relates a lot to Chris's talk. It's the breakdown of the traditional system, a complex adaptive system, and the replacement of that with what we think is high production intensive livestock production. So I just don't have an argument about that. That's all. Also most of the what we call agriculturally usable land in the world that you can use without harming it is not arable. You can't cultivate it. The only way you can get food from it is with grazing, either of livestock or wildlife. And so if you don't make use of that land, then that land is a source of food for the jillions of people on Earth is wasted. That's all.
Gillian, Richard, you got a comment, Richard Sage.
It's just a comment that, a couple of comments there, just in terms of you can't actually, any sector can't override social psychological changes in thinking. We've got a mass movement of people who are in a certain spectrum on that pyramid. They're going to go and do that. We can't do anything about that. We just need to respond to that as a situation. And the second comment was, is actually world meat consumption declining in total volume? There may be a per capita decline in some of the highly developed countries, but the underlying those two comments was that you can get into a certain feeling of sort of almost defensiveness and anxiety about these changes in people's diet, but that doesn't really help unless you can try and put it in the context of a wider change in movement. Because I've seen in my lifetime, quite a number of systems and ideas about production that have changed and gone because the social emphasis changes and it didn't. And you saw the organisations like, for example, New Zealand Forest Service. We've ended up in New Zealand with virtually no native timber production. And it got itself in a spot that it was thinking so long about producing timber and different ways of doing it. It couldn't muster an argument to continue that could convince a wide public movement. Anyway, comments.
Well, it's a problem transcending the food debate. I think it's the binary problem we have in Western thinking, and that's why Derrida came up with his pharmacon ideas. It needs a worldview shift, basically, and it needs to be. I think we need to emphasize more the fact that things in our life are indeed pharmacons. You know, they do good and bad things, and we should try to approach them in a more balanced way, not putting them in two boxes. Because that's the messages that come out now are clearly, and it's all about, I mean, I fully agree with the fact that we have to do something about a lot of the animal agriculture part. I never said the opposite. But the danger is that we just have this complexity, and just as was happening in the Daily Mail paper, where journalists either put it as something good or bad, we tend to look at it and just put it, well, we have to transition to plant-based diets. No, we don't have to transition to plant-based diets. We have to make the best of the animal side, and we have to make the best of the plant side, and especially try to integrate them in the most optimal way. And then you move forward. As long as these discourses are coming out stating that or suggesting that the animal side is the harmful part and the plant side is the good part, then we'll run into trouble. Because it's once more, if you have this very complex system, you take out the animals, what you usually don't anticipate is what something comes in place, and that will have its own repercussions on the system. And that's underestimated. We just underestimate that.
Is there any other comment?
Pablo, can I throw something in?
Yeah.
And maybe it's going a bit off track, but I think it comes down to the fact that, you know, we've created this society in the Western world where it's a competition of ideas. It's about competition. It's my idea is better than your idea. And you know, what I do is better than what you do. Whereas human society has got to where it is because of cooperation rather than net competition, in my view. And so it comes back to Chris's points about the fact that ultimately livestock, nature, humans, crops, soils can all benefit from each other. Okay, so when you look at it from a systemic point of view, there's interconnectedness and cooperation and collaboration, and there are as you say, ways in which the system can be driven towards outcomes that are not positive, and there are ways in which the system can be managed in a way that allows positive outcomes to happen. And that is when it is integrated and operating as a system rather than operating as its individual parts. And so, in my view, we have to have a transition of mindset, which is away from competition and reductionism towards complexity and systematization and collaboration.
Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Frederick. I really agree with what you're saying. The thing that I think we've got a problem once again of spotlighting averages and models. So many models just make this have this error as well. When it comes to the average cow, the average world cow, we so often see the Midwestern huge feedlot system as definitional of what farming cows is about, with all the food chains, all the energy chains that come from maize from thousands of kilometers away or whatever. So that's seen, and I think this is the trouble with the 10-second soundbite narrative that we use within media, where that extreme on the spectrum is portrayed as being what's represented by animal production in the world. And you know, we know that's not the case, but I think that we fail in the narrative, and I see this with some of the work that's come out with people basically saying that black and white view, well, obviously we can't have any animals because they are all feedlots within these systems. And I think it's really our responsibility to try to move that debate, because it's that simplistic, it's spotlight thinking. It's this tiny spotlight thinking, which then creates further problems because people are thinking in simple, disconnected, non-integrative, modern, quite frankly, terms. It's basically back to Descartes and Bacon again, where we're seeing the world in simplistic mechanical ways. The cow is X, when in actual fact it's this big range of disaster to beneficial brilliance. And I don't know how we move the debate, but we've just got to get out of this. I distrust models when they're dealing in averages. Same thing in land use. When you look at the patterns within land use, if you don't see the patterns, you will not see the potential and the synergies. You just won't. And that's what I think we fail at. Sorry.
Yep.
So I just want to throw in a comment for Chris. I mean, I agree with him wholeheartedly. And actually, I'd say the Midwestern model is just a way to use all the excess corn that we've produced. But the other part of the problem with some of that is it's not just the Midwest model. It's chopping down the rainforest to grow cattle or soybeans or that sort of thing. I mean, there's a lot of these places exactly where there are problems. And we've got to ameliorate those problems or eliminate them and show the benefits if livestock are to have a future in our foodscapes.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I'll leave my video off because I've not got a good connection. I just want to say, really interesting talks this morning, and from my perspective, and given the history of human development and civilization, I think humans perhaps need a bit of a worldview shift, as has been said, and maybe need to regenerate ourselves, and rather than agriculture, and take the focus on the dollar economy and change our measurement systems quite significantly. So I just wanted to say that.